people love to say money can't buy sincerity, but the only people who say that with full confidence are the ones who've never been crushed by the weight of not having enough. The truth, the kind most cultures refuse to admit out loud, is that money shapes the way people feel, behave, think, and even love. It doesn't manufacture emotions out of thin air, and it doesn't turn cold hearts warm. What it does is something far more subtle and far more powerful. It alters consciousness. It changes how a person perceives risk, safety, time, generosity, threat, hope, and intimacy. It decides whether someone is reacting from fear or from freedom, and that difference is everything. When people claim money doesn't matter, they aren't speaking from wisdom, they're speaking from insulation. Because in the real world, sincerity is not born from poverty, sincerity is born from stability. A mind constantly drowning in financial stress has no room for emotional clarity. It's too busy surviving. People in survival mode don't become less human, they become less available. Their brain is hijacked by urgency, scarcity, and anxiety. Every decision is filtered through the question, what if I run out? Under that psychological pressure, even the best intentions warp. A person who would normally be patient becomes tense. Someone who would normally be warm becomes distant. A person who deeply cares suddenly seems detached, not from lack of love, but from lack of mental bandwidth. Money doesn't make someone more or less sincere, it controls their capacity to express sincerity. It determines whether their emotions have room to breathe. And in a culture like America, where identity, self-worth, and survival are aggressively tied to income, money doesn't just influence consciousness. It dominates it. When bills are overdue, when rent is a threat, when debt spreads like a virus, the brain enters a form of psychological lockdown. This lockdown is not dramatic or cinematic, it's subtle, quiet, and suffocating. It shows up as irritability, avoidance, numbness, fatigue, hopelessness, or the inability to look ahead. It shrinks dreams into tasks. It turns long-term goals into daily survival. It makes a person forget who they are because they're too busy becoming who they must be to keep everything from collapsing. In that state, sincerity becomes a luxury. Not because someone becomes fake, but because emotional honesty requires a sense of safety. And safety is expensive. You can't be fully present with someone when your brain is calculating the price of tomorrow. The cruel irony is that the very people who need emotional connection the most, those under financial stress, are the ones least able to give or receive it. Money creates distance not because people become greedy, but because they become overwhelmed. Emotional availability requires mental space. Mental space requires freedom from constant threat. And freedom from constant threat requires money. That's the formula no one likes to acknowledge. On the other hand, a financially secure person doesn't necessarily become more loving or more ethical. But they gain something powerful, the ability to slow down. They have time to reflect before reacting. They have emotional patience because their survival isn't being negotiated every morning. They have energy for kindness because their mind isn't fighting invisible battles all day. They don't confuse people with problems because their problems don't chase them like wolves. So they seem more thoughtful, more steady, more genuine. But sincerity from security is not morally superior to sincerity from struggle, it's simply easier to access. It's the difference between trying to have a heartfelt conversation in a quiet room versus trying to have one while a fire alarm is screaming over your head. One person looks calm because their world is calm. Another looks chaotic because their world is chaos. Money determines the volume of the internal noise. And when the noise is loud enough, it drowns everything else out, even love, even gentleness, even sincerity. This is why two versions of the same person can exist, the struggling version and the stable version. The struggling version appears harsher, colder, distracted. The stable version appears generous, grateful, warm. It's not inconsistency, it's context. Money shapes the conditions under which someone's true personality can surface. It doesn't turn a cold heart warm, it removes the ice around it. It doesn't make someone more caring, it gives them the psychological safety to let that caring shine through. And in a society that demands emotional performance from people who are drowning economically, most people are judged by the version of themselves created by stress, not by truth. If money shapes consciousness this deeply, then of course it shapes relationships. People don't treat each other according to some pure philosophical ideal. They treat each other according to how safe or threatened they feel. Safety expands the heart, threat contracts it. Money is the difference between expansion and contraction. Americans especially understand this instinctively because the entire culture is built on a simple unspoken equation. No money equals no options equals no peace equals no presence. And without presence, sincerity collapses. People who lack financial security don't lack emotional intelligence, they lack the conditions required for emotional intelligence to operate. And people who have financial security often mistake their own calm for virtue when it's actually privilege. Love, patience, empathy, and honesty all require energy. That energy does not come for free. It comes from mental space. And mental space comes from stability. And stability comes from money. That is why the ancient philosophical idea that money can't touch the heart sounds beautiful but collapses under real-world pressure. Money doesn't replace the heart. It protects it. It doesn't create sincerity. It makes sincerity possible. It doesn't define your moral core. It determines whether your moral core gets buried or expressed. A starving person can love deeply, but they cannot love peacefully. A drowning person can care sincerely, but they cannot care consistently. And a stressed person can feel intensely, but they cannot feel safely. Money is not the root of sincerity, but it is the soil. Without fertile soil, even the strongest seed struggles to survive. And without financial safety, even the deepest emotional truth struggles to find its voice. Money doesn't just influence consciousness, it engineers it. It rewires what people consider normal, acceptable, possible, or urgent. It decides the emotional vocabulary a person has access to. Most people imagine sincerity as something pure, untouched by context. But sincerity is not some floating spiritual essence. It is a psychological state that requires bandwidth. And bandwidth requires economic safety. You can't separate human feeling from human condition. You can't separate emotional truth from the pressures pressing down on the mind. The world likes to pretend emotions float above money. But in reality, emotions grow inside whatever environment money creates. When the environment is hostile, emotions shrink. When the environment is stable, emotions expand. Money creates these environments long before anyone realizes it. People think they have free will, but when you examine their behavior closely, much of it is simply a response to whatever financial pressure or freedom surrounds them. Money shapes consciousness the same way climate shapes plants, not by force, but by condition. A plant that could grow tall in ideal soil becomes stunted in harsh soil. The seed didn't change, the environment did. Humans are no different. When someone grows up with constant financial stress, their brain learns patterns of fear, urgency, and scarcity. Even later in life, when they do have a chance to relax or connect, something inside them doesn't know how. Their nervous system doesn't understand safety because it was never given the repetition needed to internalize it. They might want to be calm, patient, warm, but their body behaves like danger is always nearby. Money shaped their consciousness long before they had conscious control. And on the opposite side, people who grow up financially secure are not necessarily better, smarter, or kinder. They're simply unscarred. Their mind was never forced into survival mode, so they internalized calmness and confidence as normal. They walk through the world with a steady heartbeat not because they are virtuous, but because nothing is chasing them. When you compare the two, it becomes obvious that sincerity isn't about purity, it's about capacity. A person who has mental space can show up fully. A person who is psychologically compressed by financial pressure cannot. This distinction is subtle but massive, and yet society constantly misinterprets it. For example, think about friendships. People say, real friends are there no matter what. It sounds noble, but it ignores something very real. When someone is financially struggling, they withdraw. They don't call as much. They don't hang out. They don't open up. They're not being distant because their heart changed. They're being distant because poverty demands emotional silence. They don't have the mental margin to socialize. They don't want to burden others. They don't want to explain. They don't want to show their stress. So they isolate themselves. And society misreads that isolation as lack of sincerity. But the truth is the opposite. Sometimes the poorest people are the most sincere. They're just too overwhelmed to perform warmth the way society expects. Being emotionally present is easier when your bills are paid. Being available is easier when your life is stable. Being kind is easier when you're not fighting invisible battles in your head all day. People underestimate how much energy emotional expression requires. Emotions are not free, they cost psychological calories, and money determines whether a person has enough mental surplus to spend those calories on connection rather than survival. That's why someone under constant financial pressure may appear irritable or cold. It's not their identity, it's their exhaustion. Exhaustion distorts the emotional signal. It doesn't change the heart, it changes the expression. And in America, where individualism is worshipped, people often assume emotional behavior is a personal choice rather than a survival response. Americans are taught, you are responsible for your reactions, which is partially true but dangerously incomplete. Most reactions come from unconscious states shaped by stress levels. And stress levels are shaped, most powerfully, by financial safety. So when people say, money doesn't affect who you are, they're ignoring the entire psychological foundation of human behavior. Money doesn't change the heart, but it controls the nervous system, and the nervous system controls expression. That's why someone can become more patient after getting a raise, or kinder after stabilizing their income, or more open after paying off debt. It's not that they suddenly changed identity, they simply regained access to parts of themselves that were blocked by fear, scarcity, or fatigue. Money didn't give them a new heart. It gave them permission to use the heart they already had. The opposite is also true. Someone financially crushed can seem colder, harder, more distant, not because they lost sincerity, but because sincerity takes energy, and energy is a luxury when survival is on the line. This is why financial instability is the silent killer of emotional life. People think relationships fall apart because of incompatibility, but often they fall apart because one or both people are psychologically compressed by money pressure. They lose patience not because they don't care, but because their nervous system is overwhelmed. They lose interest not because affection died, but because their brain is firefighting. They lose emotional presence not because love weakened, but because attention has been hijacked by survival. Money shapes attention, and attention shapes connection. Most Americans think they make emotional decisions from the heart, but in reality, they make them from the state of their nervous system, and the nervous system is shaped by economic reality. This is why money changes not just how people behave, but how they interpret meaning. A financially stable person sees generosity as a choice. A financially unstable person sees generosity as a threat to their limited resources. The same act triggers different meanings based on financial context. And when meaning changes, sincerity changes. You cannot feel deeply when everything around you is screaming urgency. This is where Americans often misunderstand each other. Two people with different economic realities do not live in the same psychological world. Someone with savings lives in a world where problems feel manageable. Someone without savings lives in a world where problems feel dangerous. Someone with financial safety lives in a world where tomorrow is predictable. Someone without safety lives in a world where tomorrow is a threat. And sincerity is shaped by the world you live in. Even moral judgment changes under financial pressure. A person under stress becomes more reactive, less reflective. They interpret neutral actions as threats. They misread tone, intention, behavior. They judge harshly or retreat quickly because their mind doesn't have the margin to process nuance. Money shapes nuance. Without nuance, people misinterpret each other. Misinterpretation destroys connection, and then society blames the individuals rather than the system compressing them. Americans often romanticize the idea that love is all you need. But psychological research, and real life, show something more complex. Love needs conditions. Emotional stability needs conditions. Sincerity needs conditions. And money provides or removes these conditions. Poverty narrows consciousness. Wealth widens it, not because one person is better, but because the brain requires safety to expand. A shrinking consciousness cannot sustain long-term emotional truth. It collapses into survival, and survival leaves no room for depth. This is why financially stable people often appear more enlightened. They aren't. They're simply not drowning. People confuse the absence of drowning with the presence of virtue. They assume emotionally steady people have superior character when in reality, they often just have superior conditions. Conditions built, protected, and maintained by financial safety. This misunderstanding is one of the reasons people misjudge sincerity. They think sincerity is measured by how calmly or consistently someone behaves. But calmness and consistency require stability. A financially overwhelmed person cannot maintain emotional consistency because their brain is constantly interrupted by stress signals. Their sincerity may be just as deep, sometimes deeper, but chaos muffles it. Money shapes the volume of sincerity. When the volume is low, people mistake it for absence. When the volume is high, people mistake it for purity. And in America, where emotional expressiveness is often viewed as a sign of authenticity, financially stressed people are unfairly judged as less genuine simply because their nervous system is too overloaded to perform emotional clarity. The truth is much darker and much simpler. Money decides whether your sincerity is visible. And what society can't see, society assumes does not exist. Most emotional injustices in human relationships come from this blindness. People expect sincerity from someone who's barely holding their life together. They demand emotional transparency from someone whose brain is running on emergency mode. They expect calm truth from someone who's psychologically cornered. It's not that the person is incapable, it's that money dictates how much of themselves they can access. And until someone experiences the psychological shift that comes with financial stability, they may never understand just how deeply money shapes their inner world. Money does not buy love, honesty, or kindness, but it buys the psychological space where love, honesty, and kindness can breathe. If money shapes the conditions in which sincerity can exist, then it also shapes the thresholds of human tolerance. People often judge others for changing when they get money. But the truth is that money doesn't transform the core. It simply reveals which thoughts were impossible to express under stress. A person who finally becomes financially stable may suddenly appear more honest, more assertive, more selective, more direct. This isn't arrogance, it's the absence of fear. Fear is what distorts behavior the most, and financial instability is one of the most potent generators of fear in modern society. When fear leaves the system, the personality recalibrates. People confuse recalibration with transformation. They assume that prosperity creates a new identity, but in reality, it frees the old one. This is why someone who felt emotionally numb for years suddenly becomes expressive when their money situation stabilizes. Their numbness wasn't emotional failure, it was psychological compression. Compression mutes everything except the task of surviving. Relief resurrects humanity. Financial relief doesn't create sincerity, it resurrects it. And this is where the connection between money and consciousness becomes impossible to ignore. Consciousness is not a fixed flame, it's a fire that needs oxygen. And in the modern world, money is oxygen. Without oxygen, the flame flickers. With enough oxygen, it rises. This is why the same human can look entirely different depending on their financial environment, not because they are inconsistent, but because consciousness adapts to the pressure around it. For the financially secure, sincerity feels abundant because their mental environment is not hostile. For the financially strained, sincerity feels risky because their mental environment is unstable. And risk transforms sincerity into silence. This silence is often misunderstood by others as emotional withdrawal. But silence is simply the psychology of exhaustion. Even empathy, a trait many people imagine is purely moral, is shaped by money. Empathy requires attention and emotional energy. People who are constantly under financial pressure often feel too drained to fully engage with the suffering of others. It isn't selfishness, it's depletion. Their emotional circuits are overworked by the demands of their own survival. Meanwhile, people with financial safety often appear more empathetic not because they are morally superior but because their minds have the capacity to absorb someone else's pain without collapsing under the weight of their own. Money shapes empathy by shaping mental availability. It regulates how much emotional bandwidth a person can extend outward. This is why Americans from different economic classes often misinterpret each other. The wealthy interpret the poor as careless, cold, or inconsistent. The poor interpret the wealthy as detached, naive, or out of touch. Both groups see behavior without seeing context. They see reactions without seeing pressure. They see expressions without seeing the environment shaping those expressions. Money is the invisible context behind every emotional response. Yet most emotional conflicts in this world are treated as moral failures rather than resource failures. Many Americans underestimate how deeply financial stress rewrites the architecture of the mind because the culture itself romanticizes self-control and emotional independence. But no amount of discipline can override the nervous system. The nervous system responds to threat automatically, and financial uncertainty is one of the clearest threats modern humans face. This is why financial stress can mimic emotional indifference. The brain in survival mode shuts down what it deems non-essential. It narrows focus to the immediate problem. It withdraws energy from reflection, connection, and introspection. It suppresses emotional subtlety in favor of strategic numbness. This numbness isn't a lack of sincerity, it's a survival reflex. And yet society expects emotional richness from people who are barely keeping themselves afloat. It asks for warmth from people who are freezing. It asks for openness from people who are overwhelmed. It asks for kindness from people running on empty. It asks for emotional patience from people whose lives give them none. Money shapes consciousness because consciousness must obey the demands of survival. This is why the mind under financial pressure becomes reactive, defensive, or inconsistent. It is not malfunctioning, it is adapting. The adaptation is often misunderstood as personality. People say, that's just how they are, when the truth is, that's just how pressure shaped them. Personality and economic environment are intertwined far more tightly than society admits. The same person inside different financial conditions becomes different versions of themselves, not because their identity changes, but because their access to their identity changes. Money determines access. Access determines expression. Expression determines perception. And perception determines how sincerity is judged. One of the most quietly destructive misunderstandings in American culture is the belief that sincerity is proven through consistency. People assume that a genuinely caring person must always act caring. A genuinely patient person must always behave patiently. A genuinely honest person must always communicate honestly. But this expectation ignores how the human mind works under pressure. Even the strongest emotional traits collapse when the nervous system is overwhelmed. Consistency requires surplus energy, and surplus energy is a luxury born from stability. Financial instability erodes consistency, not character. This is why money determines how much of your sincerity the world gets to see. A person may feel deeply but express poorly because their mind is running low on internal resources. And the world, seeing only the expression, misjudges the depth. This is the tragedy of emotional life under economic pressure. Sincerity becomes distorted by conditions it did not choose. And yet, Americans often cling to the myth that the real you is how you act when you're struggling. It's a comforting narrative for those who want to believe morality is independent from circumstance. But it is simply not true. The real you is not defined by your struggle, it is constrained by it. The real you is who you can be when your mind is not fighting for survival. The real you is who you are when you have enough peace to show it. Poverty does not reveal character, it suppresses it. Stability does not create character, it allows it. People often confuse suppressed character with revealed truth, which leads to a tremendous amount of injustice in how emotional behavior is judged. Even trust is shaped by money. People who grow up in financial instability often learn that vulnerability is risky. They internalize the belief that openness leads to loss, disappointment, or imbalance. Their consciousness becomes wired to expect instability. This expectation bleeds into their emotional behavior. They may hesitate to trust not because they lack sincerity, but because their mind has learned that safety is fragile. Meanwhile, people from financially stable backgrounds are more willing to trust because their environment taught them that stability is normal. Their consciousness is shaped by abundance rather than scarcity. Scarcity shapes suspicion. Abundance shapes openness. Suspicion is not insincerity, it is protection. Openness is not purity, it is privilege. Without understanding how money shapes these patterns, people misinterpret each other constantly. One sees coldness where there is fear. Another sees entitlement where there is safety. One sees indifference where there is exhaustion. Another sees generosity where there is surplus. Money assigns each person a different emotional lens. These lenses determine how sincerity is perceived and evaluated. This is why conversations about emotions in America are incomplete without conversations about economics. Emotional behavior cannot be separated from economic context. Money shapes time, and time shapes attention. Attention shapes connection. Connection shapes sincerity. Money shapes the entire chain. People who have time can listen. People who lack time cannot. People who have energy can empathize. People who lack energy cannot. People who have freedom can express. People who lack freedom cannot. People who have stability can be honest. People who lack stability cannot risk it. Sincerity is not a moral choice. It is a resource-dependent capacity. And the largest resource shaping it is money. This is why relationships, families, friendships, and communities often fracture along economic lines. Not because people care less, but because their ability to act on their care is unequally distributed. Money creates emotional inequality long before it creates social inequality. This is the part almost nobody talks about because society prefers to believe that emotions exist independently from economics. But emotions exist inside bodies, and bodies exist inside circumstances. Circumstances shaped by money. Even the desire to be genuine, to show up authentically, requires a feeling of safety inside the nervous system. Without that safety, authenticity becomes dangerous, and when authenticity becomes dangerous, people hide not because they are fake, but because they are afraid. Fear is the opposite of sincerity. Fear filters truth. Fear senses connection. Fear edits emotion. And financial instability is the most efficient generator of fear in modern life. This is why someone who finally becomes financially stable can feel like they suddenly found themselves. They did not find themselves, they simply stopped drowning. They finally had the space to hear their own thoughts without survival drowning them out. Money shapes consciousness because consciousness must adapt to the conditions that keep the body alive. And the body, living in a modern capitalist society, understands money as life support. This link is not philosophical, it is biological. Emotional life begins where financial threat ends. And until that threat ends, sincerity remains trapped beneath layers of noise the world cannot see. If money shapes the emotional lens through which people see themselves and each other, then it also shapes what people believe they deserve. Deserving is one of the most powerful forces in human psychology. It influences choices, boundaries, relationships, ambition, and even identity. And money quietly adjusts this internal sense of deserving without a person ever noticing it's happening. A financially stable person moves through life with an unconscious belief that good things are within reach, that opportunities are meant to be explored, that setbacks are temporary, and that their voice has weight. This belief isn't arrogance. It's the psychological byproduct of living in an environment where needs are consistently met. When needs are met, confidence becomes natural. When needs are not met, confidence must fight to exist. A person who has struggled financially for years often develops an equally unconscious belief that good things are fragile, temporary, or out of reach. They may approach opportunities with hesitation, relationships with caution, and ambitions with self-doubt. Not because they lack talent or sincerity, but because their mind has been shaped by a lifetime of instability. It is difficult to believe in abundance when scarcity has been the teacher for most of your life. Money influences a person's sense of possibility, which directly influences sincerity. When someone believes they are allowed to hope, they express themselves openly. When someone believes hope is dangerous, they stay guarded. Guardedness is often misinterpreted as lack of emotion, but it's simply emotional self-protection. The truth is that money shapes vulnerability. Financial safety makes vulnerability feel like a choice. Financial instability makes vulnerability feel like a risk. And sincerity cannot exist without vulnerability. That is why money, more than any abstract idea of character, controls how deeply people can connect with each other. It creates or destroys the emotional conditions required for truth. People think money changes priorities, but what it really changes is exposure. A person under constant pressure cannot expose their softer side, not because it disappeared, but because it cannot survive in a hostile environment. The softer side goes underground, waiting for conditions to improve. In this sense, money doesn't corrupt, it protects. It shields whatever parts of a person cannot survive stress. When financial stability returns, those parts resurface. This resurfacing is often mistaken as change, when in reality it is restoration. The heart is not a machine that turns on and off, it is more like a garden. It grows where it is watered. It shrivels where it is deprived. Money determines the climate of that garden. This is why the same person in different financial situations can seem like two entirely different individuals. One version is living under storms. The other is living under sunlight. And sunlight does not create new seeds. It allows existing seeds to grow. In America especially, where financial identity is tied to personal identity, people often confuse their income with their worth. Society subtly reinforces this. Those who earn more are seen as more responsible, more intelligent, more disciplined, more trustworthy. Those who earn less are often judged as less organized, less motivated, less capable, less stable. These judgments are not reflections of character, they are reflections of social bias. Money becomes the metric through which sincerity and value are measured, even though sincerity has nothing to do with wealth and everything to do with cognitive capacity. But humans rarely see capacity, they see behavior. And behavior under pressure is vastly different from behavior under peace. This is why money shapes perception. People attribute behaviors caused by stress to personality. They misinterpret the symptoms as the core. They assume someone's emotional distance, irritability, or inconsistency is who they are, when it is often just what they are forced to be under the pressures shaping their mind. Financial pressure can turn mountains into walls, opportunities into risks, conversations into confrontations, relationships into obligations, and dreams into burdens. It distorts the emotional map people navigate. And when the map distorts, sincerity becomes conditional, not because sincerity is fake, but because sincerity requires clarity, and clarity requires mental safety. In this way, money decides not only how people feel but how they interpret feelings. It shapes the narratives they believe about themselves. A financially stable person can interpret setbacks as challenges. A financially unstable person may interpret the same setbacks as confirmations of inadequacy. Money shapes self-talk, and self-talk shapes self-awareness. This is why two people with equal intelligence, equal compassion, and equal sincerity can have entirely different internal lives. One lives with mental freedom, the other lives with mental friction. Freedom allows the mind to travel inward, to explore emotions deeply, to understand motives, to articulate truth. Friction forces the mind outward, toward tasks, threats, logistics, obligations, and fears. Money pushes the mind toward introspection or away from it. And introspection is where sincerity lives. Without it, emotions become reactions instead of reflections. Sincerity becomes fragmented. People often associate sincerity with simplicity, as if sincerity thrives in humble, stripped-down conditions. But simplicity is not the same as scarcity. Simplicity can exist with safety. Scarcity cannot. Scarcity hijacks the mind. It narrows the emotional field. It shrinks the capacity to reflect and connect. People surviving under scarcity are not less sincere. They are less free to express sincerity. Their feelings don't vanish, they compress. Over time, that compression can harden into a form of emotional minimalism. Not the peaceful, intentional kind, but the strained, survival-based kind. They speak less, share less, hope less, because their mind has learned that every emotional investment requires energy they cannot spare. And this is where money shapes something even deeper than emotion. It shapes meaning. Meaning is not something people choose. Meaning is something people receive. A financially stable person can find meaning in connection, in passion, in creativity, in learning, in community. A financially unstable person must find meaning in endurance. Their consciousness orbits around what must be done, not what could be explored. Even or, the feeling of being moved by something larger than oneself, is shaped by money because all requires mental spaciousness. When life shrinks, money expands or contracts the emotional universe people live in. This is why financial stability feels like breathing, and financial instability feels like tightness. People describe it physically because it is physical. The nervous system responds to money like it responds to oxygen. Emotional life collapses when deprived of either. And here is the darkest truth. Money not only shapes consciousness, it shapes who people are allowed to be. Society rewards emotional behaviors that require mental peace, then punishes the people who cannot access those behaviors because they live under pressure. It labels stressed people as difficult. It labels overwhelmed people as unreliable. It labels anxious people as dramatic. It labels exhausted people as distant. But these labels describe symptoms, not identities. Money filters who gets to be seen in their fullness and who gets to be seen only through the distortions of scarcity. This is why judging sincerity without accounting for economic context will always be inaccurate. You cannot evaluate the depth of a person by looking at their behavior under stress. You must look at the version of them that appears when fear is removed. Fear and truth cannot share the same room. Money determines which one gets to stay. The irony is that people imagine money corrupts emotions. But the opposite is true. Money reveals the emotions that stress had buried. What people interpret as changing because of money is often just the unveiling of a personality that had been hidden behind years of psychological disruption. Money doesn't distort sincerity, stress does. And because stress is so often tied to financial instability, money becomes the switch that turns sincerity on or off. Not authenticity, but access to authenticity. This is why arguments like money shouldn't matter in relationships or friendships are idealistic rather than realistic. Money determines whether two people have enough mental space to connect honestly. When both are stable, sincerity flows. When one is stable and the other isn't, sincerity becomes uneven. When both are unstable, sincerity becomes drowned by fear. The emotional climate shifts with the financial climate. It's not shallow, it's biological. Humans do not bond through intentions alone, they bond through regulated nervous systems. For a nervous system to regulate, it needs safety, and in the modern world, safety is inseparable from money. So when we say, money shapes consciousness, what we really mean is that money shapes the conditions required for the mind to operate at its full capacity. And when we say, money shapes sincerity, what we really mean is that money shapes the emotional bandwidth required for sincerity to be expressed. The heart may be infinite, but the mind is not. The mind is bounded by environment, energy, and economics. Money is not the source of sincerity, but it is the gatekeeper. It decides when sincerity is possible, when it is muted, when it is hidden, and when it is drowned by forces stronger than emotion itself. In the end, money doesn't change who people are. It changes what parts of themselves